One pack, green, over. 5716, roger, over.
I think 1592, one Victor, two packs, Recon 1, over.
Henry's doing a great job kicking things off while muted. A classic start.
Excuse me. Anyways,
go,
we are live. Welcome to the show. Welcome, everybody. And I'd love to give a warm welcome to our friend Calvin from Firepower United. Many of you have seen a lot of, I guess we've done, you and Josh have done live sessions on IG more so than YouTube or Facebook. But Calvin's a friend of ours, also a Texan. A interesting fact about Calvin is some of you guys may know him as an entertainer, aka his old alter ego Phuc Long. However, Calvin's actually a fairly accomplished shooter on the sports shooting side. And then also Calvin and I jive on the collector side. So Calvin's also a military collector's firearm, let's say a fellow military collector, a firearm collector nerd. So Calvin has a very unique, yes, indeed. Calvin has a very unique, let's say, duality of interests that drop both into Josh's bucket and my bucket. So this type of live session has been long awaited and long anticipated to work with Calvin on. Anyways, Josh.
Well, before we give Calvin a chance to add into any of that intro, I do want to remind everybody we're live on YouTube, on the 9-Hole Reviews channel, the 9-Hole Podcast channel, as well as Facebook. If you guys are on the 9-Hole Reviews YouTube Live, feel free to drop any super chats you have. We will do answers to any of the super chat questions that come in to go along with some of the Patreon questions that we've got slated for the show tonight. And with that said, Calvin, Henry gave your bio there, but why don't you introduce yourself a little bit for those who might not be familiar with Firepower United?
Sure. So, hi, my name is Calvin Trung, and I guess I made myself famous by making silly videos on the internet that had a deeper meaning to them when it came to firearms and the understanding of their use. So what I did mostly was make fun of the typical things that instructors would teach, but made very little sense. Things like probably the biggest one was like the gross motor skills, where you had to, like, the only way to run a firearm is if you can only under stress, you're only able to use the big parts of your hands. If you actually read the definition of gross motor skills, it's literally like your elbows and your knees. So it's like anything with, including your hands, those are still fine motor skills. So like racking the slide by power stroking it, that's still a fine motor skill. So people would use these wrong definitions. So I would take them literally and then demonstrate them and just make a very ridiculous video, and it would go viral because everyone would get angry at them. So that's kind of what I did. But then on top of that, I do enjoy collecting firearms, and I do enjoy the history behind them and their development. So I treat the whole performance shooting thing as a completely separate hobby from collecting. But somehow they do intertwine here and there. So that's kind of that's why I like your guys' channel, because you do combine that. Most people don't.
So that's actually going to pivot us into the conversation, I think, for tonight with respect to at least the difference between performance shooting and how you bucket that completely separately from collecting and the firearms you may choose to collect. Just for those who have you gotten the GM card yet? If not, you're close, right?
I still have a ways to go. I'm a 2-division master, I think, since last time we talked. I'm production and CO master now, but I'm not quite a GM yet.
Okay, gotcha. So what that translates to, guys, is Calvin is really, really, really good at shooting handguns. Just not quite as good as the guys who win the championships in the States. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I pretty much stay behind the top shooters in the country.
So, with that said, then let's talk about the subject for tonight's live, which is the adage, a good craftsman never blames his tools. And before Henry throws up his sassy comments onto the screen, what I want to kind of do here is lay the foundation for why we wanted to talk about this. Because when we operate in the world of extremes, extreme yeses and extreme nos, the absolutes, generally we find ourselves in a position where we're going to stumble at some point. So when we use terms like never, there's usually some circumstance that can be crafted where we identify where that's incorrect or not true. So what we're probably going to do throughout this session is discuss this adage, see how it applies to shooters who are just sort of getting started in the sport, or in the broader sense of shooting in general, not just practical or sport shooting. And then extending that out to how the three of us have gone on our own journeys, I'd say, in identifying and sort of balancing out this adage and how it applies to our own shooting. So, Henry, take us away.
Okay. So the way a lot of this started, and I don't know, did we talk about super chats already?
Yep.
We'll
cover them all at the after the core subject. We'll hop into all of those and read through them all.
All right. So this entire topic really, it came out on the AK-12 video that we recently released. And we sort of anticipated that anytime you put a very critical look at a firearm or a tool or something that people hold high regards to, especially if you don't have a lot of experience on the particular firearm itself, which is a dangerous zone. If you have a comment about something, but you haven't really used it a lot, we anticipated actually for there to be more, let's say, critical comments on our very critical video itself, which this comment popped up, and it generated some of our internal conversation between Josh and I and a lot of the Patreon supporters over on our internal Discord, and actually Calvin as well. And so Brandon here, and again, I don't approach this facetiously, even though my comments very, a good craftsman never blames his or her tools, is what Brandon said. And while there is a part of this that is true, it really depends on the context. As Ian said in one of his past videos, a good craftsman also doesn't buy his tools from Harbor Freight, which that kind of hurts me because I do have a few torque wrenches and collectible tools from Harbor Freight that I use myself. So I responded to this comment with, "Oh yeah, well, why don't you force an Amish carpenter to make you a nice cabinet with a butter knife? I mean, a good craftsman never blames his tool after all." Blames his tools after all, plural. But regardless, it's a comment that I think in the process of learning about shooting and practicing sort of the skill of shooting rifles, and specifically for me, I heard this a lot with iron sight shooting, the NRA service rifle type iron sight shooting. I kept on hearing a good craftsman never blames his or her tools. And I think in the process of learning and learning a skill, this is a very useful saying to sort of prep some of the, let's say, some of the more cockier newbies who were trying to get into it, and I'm glad I had people to lead me through various techniques that I still use nowadays. Let's say like holding wind with no dials, using your front sight post to hold windage as well, which is why I don't like barleycorn sights, by the way. Those are techniques that I learned because I went through a time period where I pushed myself to understand that I want to be a good craftsman. And so I want to perfect my skill, even though if I'm shooting a more primitive type of sighting system, I could still apply good marksmanship techniques to it and achieve the connecting the dot between your projectile and your target. So as you progress on, though, and you still hear someone say something like this, when let's say you're shooting a Kalashnikov at 500 yards, like, yes, you can make an impact with an AKSU at 500 yards. We did do that, but am I confident that I could do that every single round pushing out? No, I am not. So that really generated a lot of the internal conversation between us and our patrons and guys like Calvin on where does this sit? I mean, where do the two extremes sit then? Where we're discussing skill level versus the item that you're using, the tool that you're using, the rifle that you're firing. So that's where it went. That's where it came about.
So, Calvin, I know the answer for me, but I'm interested to hear your take on this. Have you ever been at a match and either you yourself or other people around you made comments to the effect of, if I just had that gun, those sights, that trigger job, that belt system, those mag carriers, XYZ, fill in the blank, I would be able to do what that shooter is doing, to reference somebody who is beating you or beating that person?
Oh, you hear it all the time, especially with newer shooters. They'll see a guy who's shooting an open gun, which is basically no rules. You can have a compensator, red dot, etc., etc. And those guys are just shooting, like their hair's on fire, and it's like super fast. And some of those splits can almost be like machine gun splits. And you hear someone say, "Oh, well, if I had that gun, I could do that." And what you don't realize is just because the gun is going fast doesn't mean that the competitor's time difference is only because of that one thing, the splits. There are so many other aspects in shooting a match or shooting a stage that have nothing to do with the gun at all. And people don't really take that into account when they first start out. Like how efficient you are moving from one spot to the next, how quickly you can move your gun from one target to the next. People kind of forget about that, or not forget because they haven't been exposed to it, so they don't even think about it initially.
That's it, right? I mean, I have done this. When I got into shooting carbine, like I was chasing every piece of gear that existed as I sort of got deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. It went from putting a comp on the gun to getting adjustable gas to the tuned internals and all, to this barrel length because it's got to be, and you just go down the line, and eventually you come to a realization at some point in the shooting progression with enough practice where a line does happen and you realize, wow, I did a lot of stupid stuff.
You'd be surprised by what is doable with a factory bone stock Glock. There are guys who will destroy on the circuit with just the factory Glock in production or carry optics. And they, the common misconception is you need to have some super crazy modified CZ variant, which, I fell into that. I own one, I shoot that. That's kind of what I did, but I learned on that gun, so I'm not going to go and switch at this point. But I realized after I learned how to shoot my Tamfolio really well, I could also shoot a Glock. I could also shoot an M&P or an HK or anything. So it kind of, after you learn the technique, it doesn't really matter which gun you have, as long as they're all able to do the same things. Can this gun hold a 3-inch group at 25 yards, off a bench? Does it actually fit in my hands? Will the magazines hold 10 rounds or more? Yeah. So as long as it meets some minimum requirements, it will be good enough for the task, at least in USPSA. You get into other types of shooting, you have to find whatever task that particular tool has to do. That's why there's minimum requirements for things. You look at I know Henry would probably know more about this than I do, but if you look at military acquisitions, there's typically a minimum requirement of some sort.
And some of those requirements are really strange, though, and I mean that's a really long rabbit hole to go down into. Actually, I was just talking to I think one of our mutual friends, Ashley, on Instagram. The what's her name? The Brengun girl.
Angel of Verdun.
Yeah. And we were just talking about the military requirements for the Mark 23, where you had to have a separate decocker lever from the safety. And the H&K USP 45 tactical actually has a more sensible trigger system than the military requirement that generated the Mark 23, which is incidentally a pistol the size of a Deagle that shoots 45 ACP. Literally mag capacity and everything, it does the exact same thing as a USP 45 tactical, but the requirements generated something a lot more differently to it. But on the military side, just kind of steering us back to what we're talking about, this conversation, my M21 is an M14 based rifle. And before everybody out there starts this whole conversation about the M14, is it the best rifle the US adopted? Probably not. But is it a horrific rifle that will get you killed in the streets? Also, there are attributes that could get you killed in the streets, I suppose, but not necessarily, that bad that it would just explode in your face or whatever. However, I got into that with this mentality that people would say, oh, the M14, it's inherently accurate, is what they would say. The M14 was pulled out of the stores when the US needed it the most to make the M21 sniper weapon system. And therefore, see, if you cannot shoot the M14 well, you see, a craftsman does not ever blame his tools. And so that kind of like what Josh was talking about, going out and trying to buy every single kit to enhance your gear as much as possible. I did that with my M14 and it did not work. And for a long time, I doubted myself. I was like, am I having problems? I mean, am I doing something technique wise? Because outside of sending it to a good gunsmith, I've done everything I could to accurize the M14 and it just did not do anything until then. I got a bolt action, the Remington, and not this one. It was a previous one before I joined the army. And all of a sudden I could shoot at distance because turns out the M14/M21 system had a significant accurization process that turned that specific weapon system into something that you could actually use for long range engagements. And I did not do that. And so, but I did not blame the tool. But that also wasn't that I did not learn the techniques. In that particular instance, the M14 pre-accurization was not performing to the task that I wanted it to perform. Now, as a straight leg infantry rifle, sure. It probably would work, but as a precision rifle, it needs a lot more work and a lot more money dumped into it. So, on the military side, I would say there's also that, sometimes you never know what you end up with, but you can't just apply one adage to it because that generates a significant fallacy that has you chasing down the wrong solutions to your problems. So that's something that, just jumped out to me right now.
So what you just described then, Henry, is just two factors to this that I think we should dig into just a bit further. The first one is the idea of, as a shooter, how do you select the appropriate tool for the task? Because I think that some of this adage actually is built upon the idea that a good craftsman is also selecting the appropriate tool. So at some point in time, if we have an issue where the tool is not up to the task, well, that goes back to you should have done a better job selecting an optimal tool for what you are intending to do. So within the confines of that component of this conversation, Calvin, that was something you brought up when we were having some sidebars on this before deciding to go live with it. Where do you guys draw those lines within the confines of your own shooting, I don't know, spectrum? For you, Calvin, where does it fall, say, between when you're doing, competitive shooting and action shooting versus, using firearms for more collector-based components?
So with my competition gun, since I'm really dumb, what I did was I found the most successful people doing what I do, and I basically just copied what they did. So the multi-time national champion at the time, he was using Tanfoglio pistols. So I was like, you know what? If he's using a Tanfoglio pistol, I probably can't go wrong going with that. And then, so because you don't know what you're doing, at least you won't be going the wrong direction if you're doing the exact same thing as someone else and using their tools. And as you learn more, you can make adjustments or find out it doesn't work for you. But it should at least get you to a level to where you can make your own decision. It's because the other alternative is buying a completely wrong or inappropriate firearm for the task, which, for USPSA. So that's basically what I did, and so far I've been happy with it. Don't really plan on changing. When it comes to like the collectible firearms, I actually don't really put performance in my criteria for purchase. That has a lot more to do with how interesting it is based on its history and how collectible it is in the market. So I really don't care how well it performs. Well, I wouldn't say I don't care at all. Like, it actually has to send bullets out and hit stuff. So as long as it's within the parameters of what the original military that used it, it's somewhere in that ballpark, I'm happy, because I use it for a plinking for fun type scenario versus something I'm trying to beat people with at the competition.
But if you do dunk on someone at a USPSA 3-gun match with a Kalashnikov, a stock Kalashnikov, oh my.
That would be cool. With the amount of talent there is out there right now, it would be tough. You could probably win against people who are not as skilled maybe at your local match, but if you're going against the best guys in the nation, you're probably going to need the best equipment as well.
Well, so I did pop up a question that was posed to us by a patron supporter. Who's your Batman? In the context of new shooters, how big a role does perceived effectiveness or deficiency in the platform play in skill development? And can you become a good workman if you only learn on bad tools? I felt that this was fairly relatable to what we're talking about right now. And I wanted to caveat this with a lot of what we talked about before. When we were getting, I think the three of us got into shooting around the same time, the flow of information was not nearly as widespread as it was right now. I think, Josh, when you and I were really getting into it, the Magpul videos were out. That's about it. That's all you did. That's all you had to really. Oh yeah.
Okay.
And it's funny too, because you see at the 3-gun matches, you'd see guys who obviously watched the Magpul videos you would shoot with them right before, and they would just be doing their regular thing, and then all of a sudden they started like extending their C clamp all the way out forward, and you're like, aha, I know where that came from. But nowadays there's multiple sources. I mean, it's not just that. The amount of trainers that are out there, the amount of information that you could access is significantly different. So I wanted to put that into context to, you know, what we're talking about when we first got into it. That's a little bit different from now. Also referencing to what Calvin was talking about, you know, when you're looking at the top shooters and what they're using, there's a reason for that, because that itself is trying to vulture somebody else's mistakes and or experiences that generated that loadout and learn from it. But so, gentlemen, in the context of new shooters, how big a role does perceived effectiveness or deficiency in a platform play in a skill development? Can you become a good workman if you only learn from bad tools? And I think there has to be a definition to this. What is a bad tool? I personally think a bad tool is something that does not fit the job. I mean, it's like the guys using a Dremel tool to do what they should be using a mill for.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer under the guise of a bad tool. I think we need to adjust that to a degree to make this a little bit more palatable to answer. Because I think if you're using something that woefully misses the mark on what you're trying to accomplish, then you inevitably will develop habits or, you know, concepts of how you perform certain actions based around trying to solve for the inadequacies of that item. If we talk about something that's, say, suboptimal or not optimized, i.e. a stock Glock 19 as opposed to a full-blown Tanfo, right? To use Calvin's analogy from earlier, I think that makes this a much more interesting conversation to have, because there is a line, at least in my mind, where as a new shooter, I would perceive that particular firearm is subpar compared to those who I'm trying to shoot against, right? In terms of competitive atmosphere. But if I'm able to use that particular firearm effectively or practice on a stiffer trigger, less optimized sights, so on and so forth, over time, putting in the hours, I feel like at the end of that particular set of training, I'm going to come out perfectly sufficient to be able to compete as a skilled shooter and develop the skill sets required to be effective.
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, I'd say if we put this into, like for me, in long range terms, right? Josh, you know, my training rifle, my learning rifle for long range was the Remington 700 5R with a cheap but effective SWFA Super Sniper 10x42. And it is a package. And again, this was back in the 2000s. That was a $1,000 package that you could get, well, maybe like 1,000 and change, like a little bit over 1,000. That's not a very expensive package that you could take a 308 to 1,000 yards. And is it the bee's knees? I mean, compared to things nowadays? No, my AR, my accuracy internationals outshoot those things like very, very well. The recoil is much lower. The action is much nicer. The scopes that I put on the AI with the current grid system is much more refined. But does that mean that the cheaper Remington is a poor choice for a learner? No, in what you're talking about, Josh, you know, the stiffer triggers, some of the more difficult items have to be delineated from something that straight up wasn't performing. Even though that's cheaper, even though it is more difficult to use those things, it was not losing zero like the M14 pre M21 conversion. So that's a huge difference. If you have a rifle losing zero, like the M20, the pre-M21 rifle, that was very difficult to learn long range from. It doesn't matter how much you dial, it doesn't matter how much you try to compensate for wind. If your rifle is slopping around in that stock, you're not going to get the data that you need for, on previous engagements for next engagements. And so the price point versus whether something is good or bad, is it correlated? In some cases they are, but it's not a definitive thing. There are ways of using something that is less financially challenging and slightly more difficult, but in the long term, turning you into a better shooter. I think the whole entire thing about shooting with rudimentary sights, iron sights, helps you understand a lot of the mechanics more before you progress to optics. But that's, again, I mean, does that mean that's all you should be doing forever? Some guys never progress from that too. On the other end, some guys then would say that your iron sights could do the same thing as optics could. In what context? In the speedways that we've been running, Josh, it's clear that iron sights cannot take the place of optics when you're under time constraint or when your mind is really amped up with a lot of firing solutions that you're trying to apply. So it depends on the context.
Yeah, I found the people who don't make a delineation between iron sights and optics do not shoot under any type of time constraints. Sure, I guess mechanically it is possible to be equally as accurate with irons, but the amount of time it takes, the amount of concentration is significantly higher.
Agree 100%. And that's sort of where we, on the show, when we talk about optics, we try to emphasize the idea that the optic doesn't make the rifle mechanically more accurate, but it certainly impacts your ability to ultimately shoot more accurately with the rifle, especially as you identify under time constraints. So this question here is sort of on one end of the timeline in terms of time spent training and practicing with your given tools. Where do you guys see the line being for when you can start to fall into an area where you're able to make differentiation between actually understanding and being realistic with yourself that you took a bad shot, you did something that was, you didn't check the wind, the Remington, the M24 video, Henry, we didn't catch a wind shift. Not the rifle's fault, our fault. Being realistic about that assessment. It was an issue that we had shooting that rifle. How do you go from versus, say, something along the lines of a rifle is only so accurate, right? We can try printing it 100 different times and we're realistic about ourselves with each trigger press and we call good shots, but we're still getting a 3.5-inch group for, the AK-12, for example. Where in your shooting journey and your ability to assess based on the amount of training you had done at the time, where did you start to find yourself crossing over into an area where you actually believe that you've outgrown that newer or newbie belief that like, oh, I got to buy and chase the best piece of gear, and falling into I called a good shot. It didn't go where I wanted to. I need to check and make sure the sights are on. I need to, assess X, Y, or Z. Where for you guys did that line sort of cross?
I think it's easier to take responsibility for your mistakes when your gear is on towards the higher end of the spectrum in terms of quality, because then there's no doubt in your mind that it was the tool and it was 100% you. So that's kind of where I like to go with it. Being a gun nerd, I will spend more towards those type of things. I know not everyone can, but that's been my experience. I try to buy the the best, within reason, that I can afford, versus trying to buy the bare minimum and then seeing where, what I can do with it. Which is kind of unfortunate because it's like kind of the opposite of the advice I give, but it's easier to say it than to do it. Because when you're coming from a place with zero experience or very little experience, it's hard it's hard to believe that statement. I could do it now, knowing what I know, but I don't think I would have been able to start with a Glock 19 when I was brand new.
And Henry,
At least
how about you?
And not feel good about it.
So Josh, I've had a fervent personal belief that I want to hone my rudimentary sighting system skills. So basically iron sights. That's been a major focus for my personal development through the years. It's not that I don't shoot scopes. I find it more interesting that these two pieces of metal can line up and shoot like that. However, prior to doing the 9-hole reviews project, especially prior to doing practical accuracy, when I grabbed all sorts of different types of rifles and just put it on the field to test it on a KD range. Prior to that, I did not have that confidence level that I could grab multiple different types of weapon systems and just shoot it. I mean, I was confident that I could print decent sized groupings between different rifles. Yes. But there's only so much you could do at a 100 or 200 yard range. That's the bottom line. So prior to subjecting myself into a lot of personal trial, it was very difficult to tell whether I could or couldn't do that. I mean, there's always going to be the barstool chat of, oh yeah, I could do that, with the boys, whether you're hanging out on the range or off range watching a movie or whatever. But for me, when I got to put that amount of trigger time, I think, Josh, we were filming for months before we even released the first practical accuracy, just because we wanted to see if this even had legs to as a show. And prior to that, we were already working the KD ranges to figure out different rifles. And so that was the only way I was trying to be honest with myself, is to really push myself to see if I could perform. And so I'd say for a lot of guys out there, once you see yourself being able to do something and repeat that result, then you should be able to have that confidence to say, yeah, that's what I could do. Which incidentally, in the military, because a lot of times you would do, because a lot of times in the military you would do for us in the Army, you would do 300-meter qualifications with the M16. I knew that the M16A2, you could dial it and it would correspond there. I knew that this is where you had to put the group on the zero paper in order for your sights to correspond out there. I knew to zero windage first and then deal with the elevation afterwards to correspond it to the military qual course. But I'd say this: unlike the Marines, the Army doesn't put you through a whole week of qual or prep time before your qual, whereas the Marines actually, they have Marines shoot for a whole week before they even qual at the 500-yard range. And so they let them see that, hey, you could do this. You can actually perform like this. The rifle can actually do this. And then you get that confidence, which is, in my mind, I mean, as much as I make fun of the Marines for 500 yards, like Jeep-sized target, that is a hell of a confidence builder. And you still see that confidence in Marines who leave service still saying, hey, I could shoot 500 yards with iron sights and hit that target. And that's a big deal. I mean, sometimes, again, when we're talking about this in context of whether it, how are you taking that particular statement in context? I mean, there are There are guys who then say, "Oh, I could shoot 500 yards with iron sights and hit my target." Yeah, well, how big is your target when you're comparing to what some other people are doing, shooting a 500-yard target with an AK with iron sights? I mean, that's at a torso target. It's a different topic, but still, the practice of subjecting yourself in a situation to perform it and doing it repeatedly and building that confidence, I think that is a vital part of pushing yourself into recognizing that you can do that.
So I think what we've just said across the board is a bias towards accepting that it is most likely that if you have selected the appropriate tool for the task at hand, that if you do have a miss, having a bias towards accepting that it was probably your fault that you had the miss. That's sort of what I heard from both of you guys as part of that conversation. I think you arrived at that slightly differently, but I do think that that's probably a generally safe practice to at least start out with as you go through self-diagnosing what went wrong on a given shot or a given set of shots or a given stage at a match or whatever it may be. I mean, is that a fair assessment or characterization of both of your opinions?
I'd say so to an extent.
Go ahead.
Oh, I mean, there have been times where the equipment actually is faulty, and because people like us, we're so used to blaming ourselves, we kind of forget to diagnose the equipment. Some common things, at least in USPSA, would be like lead buildup in a compensator, which could actually cause bullets to deflect. So something like that. But yeah, for the most part, if you're just starting, yeah, definitely blame yourself.
And Henry, I mean, your thought on that is that still a fairly accurate assessment of your belief, bias towards self-blame?
Well, I mean, experience level helps you negate a lot of uncertainties, I would say. So, yes.
Okay, so then what I would like to do is explore one further question, and then we can carry on with some of the other questions that we had come in. But if that's the case, and to your point, yes, some experience level is going to help you negate or better diagnose things that could be going wrong with the gear, with the tool. Why is it that, especially on our show, we make a concerted effort to talk very specifically about how the guns feel and things that we do or don't like about what the firearms are doing as we're shooting them? Because I think that might, we do that as part of the show for a reason, but I think it might give off potentially the wrong vibe about, and spawn the very question that generated this conversation.
What do you think, Josh? Just you tell us what you think about it.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to we're trying to express as a YouTube show to a wide audience who may or may not have ever even held the particular firearm that we're shooting. We're trying to express some of the very subtle differences that we may or may not be experiencing while we shoot. That somebody who hasn't had access to a bunch of different firearms to shoot, or who hasn't trained as much, or who hasn't done X, Y, or Z, they might never even understand or feel what it is that we're talking about when we are describing, say, the recoil impulse on the Scar Light compared to an AR. They're both 5.56 guns. They both feel really similar. If you're not used to shooting ARs at an extremely high level, quote unquote, that's just, match speak, whatever. You might never even know that there's a difference, but we made a specific point to address that difference in our practical accuracy run we published a few weeks ago. We are, I believe, attempting to explain some small intricacies and differences, but sometimes in doing so, maybe we are overemphasizing how big of a difference those things actually are.
I have a thought on this. I know Josh. I know you like wine. You and your wife, and we all hang out and drink wine. Calvin, are you a fan of wine?
I am not a wine drinker.
Okay. Have you been in an environment where someone was acting like a sommelier, someone who was a massive wine connoisseur, and
Oh yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So you have people who would. I don't know if it's a social anxiety thing that pushes them to act like they know what wine they're talking about. It doesn't just happen in the States. It also, when I was in France, it happens to French people, some French people who don't know it as well. And when they were trying, and me, I mean, I just showed up and I was like, wow, this is magical red juice. Let me try some. And some of them, and not, they're much more knowledgeable than we are, but they are by no means a professional sommelier. And so, not all of them. A lot of them are very honest with it. But you will see certain personalities who come out and try to act like that with a very limited knowledge on the wine palettes. And so I think that's sort of applied here, where, a lot of times with our backgrounds to push, a lot of different weapon systems, and we've tried, let's say, all these different vintages at this point, and we are able to detect a slight hint of raspberry tones in this particular wine. And we know that it corresponds to this year at that particular village's soil content because they had, let's say, better rain, and therefore the harvest yielded that tone, right? We are able to think about that in context, not just for the precisions or the sporting stuff, but a lot of times also with the historical stuff. This is very applicable to what we're talking about with wines too. But then a lot of times you also have, and I'm not saying this is every military person, military who are expected in certain branches, certain whatevers, MOSs, you're expected to be an expert in that weapon. And so, like 5 or 10 weapon systems very, very well, which is more than a lot of the other support guys would. But then you leave and you were military. So you're expected to know X, Y, Z about the whatever weapon systems. And then you're asked about, what about the Kalashnikov? Aha. Well, yeah, it was. It's they're basically Russian rifles. They can't shoot past 300 because you're regurgitating things. So I mean, I think sometimes people get put into that social constraint or that position to where they have to shoot something back in order to make conversation. And I mean, it's a human thing to do. We've all been in party situations where we feel pressured to do that. But if you take a step back and think of it, you very well could say, well, my service weapon was an M4. So we shot at a lot of people with Kalashnikovs. I did not get shot by one. But I personally don't have a lot of experience on them. That's a perfectly acceptable answer as well. So
now everyone thinks we're alcoholics, Henry.
I do like wine. Anyways, I mean, let me see what comments that yielded. Let's see. Someone says,
do you want to roll back through the super chats, Henry, seeing how we're about to hit at the hour marker here?
Yeah, sure. We do it. We do have a few more interesting comments from some patrons, but we'll hit up some super chats first. This one, though, I have no idea where this came from. In the chats I wrote, Gongtao Hall. You've actually had it, Josh. Josh and I used to hang out at lunch in Chinatown in Houston. I would order in Chinese, and you remember the beef fried noodles, Gongtao Hall.
Most delicious.
Every now and then. Yeah, very nice.
Are those the flat noodles, or is it a different kind of fried noodle? Oh, okay.
It's the flat noodles. Yeah.
These are the riveting questions that people want to know about. I mean, meanwhile, I saw the first half of the chat was just talking about the food of my people. So,
oh yeah,
yes.
The
raviolis, the carbonaras, the bolognese.
I do like Italian food, and Josh knows Italian better than I do. Well, of course, the mozzarella. Let's see. This one was actually, this is related to one of the questions that we have right here. So, Oedipus Rex, in effect, wrote, what rifle was the biggest disappointment for the two of you, and including you too, Calvin, individually? I.e., what rifle, and I would say, or pistol, since we're talking a lot about the pistols as well, or platform were you very excited or hyped up via the internet, yet we found it underwhelming or just downright unappealing? This could be from, let's say, the price to performance standpoint, or the hype to real life performance. And it doesn't have to just include the guns reviewed on the channel, but anything else that we've experienced. And then Rook followed that up. Do you own any objectively bad guns, notorious brands, poor calibers to size ratio, gimmicky, obsolete actions? Which this is what Matt Sif also said.
Right.
Has there been a weapon that you guys wanted to review knowing that it would be hilariously awful? The answer is yes to all of these questions, but I would like to hear from you guys first.
I'll go first. The Tavor was, I think, one of the larger. I mean, the AK-12 was obviously like, I've turned into a bit of a Kalash boy, but the AK-12 was, okay, that's low-hanging fruit since everybody's talking about it right now. But the Tavor, I remember just like, I really wanted it to be cool and to be good. And it just, the accuracy was just really not fantastic for a 16-inch modern 5.56 gun. That would be the one that I thought was like a real downer.
Well, so kind of like the Mark 23, though, the Tavor was, its requirement did not require it to perform any better than that on the accuracy side. So that's sort of an artificial requirement we've done in America with our civilian requirements for it to perform better than that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, same, because that was not marketed, that was not said initially, but the Tavor certainly looks really cool. And I felt like for the era, it seemed like they were solving a lot of ergonomic problems that people were having, problems, if you may. But yeah, I mean, we were shooting that with the issued optic too, right?
Yeah, it was just one that I wanted to be a lot better. I didn't particularly like shooting it on the close range side. I know we didn't really even publish anything about it on the close range side, but I just really didn't care for it all around. I thought it was going to be like, I was actually close to going out and getting one, and then we got one in, and it was a bit of a womp womp. Calvin,
So what about you, Calvin?
What about you? Yeah.
I guess I'll bring up a rifle. My original answer was going to be a handgun, but I think more people watching this are going to be more relate better with rifles. So this one is a fairly recent import. It's the Polish Radom barrel, but the 7.62 by 3.9 version. So I don't know what it is about the batches that we got, or if it applies to all of them, but mine wouldn't shoot better than like 8 to 10 MOA. And then I also had some friends, well, a friend, so one friend who compared his at using a red dot sight. He was shooting like 7 MOA. So like the guns are not very accurate of the two we tried. And then there was I had another Instagram follower say the same thing. Like his was in like the 8 range. So that's 3 samples. And
I'd be curious in why though. I mean, because the 5.56 shoots fine.
The 5.56 shoots like a normal AK should.
Yeah.
And I thought that was crazy because I'll shoot my barrel 7.62 back to back with my Polytech Legend just to make sure like I was able to shoot fine. And the Legend would shoot like a 4 MOA ish group, 5 shots, and then the Polish barrel would shoot like a 8 to 10 MOA group with 5 shots. So that was a huge disappointment, knowing I guess the reputation that FB Radom has, and kind of being excited for it. But man, that was a big disappointment for me. So I got rid of that gun.
So if I were to talk about a disappointment, I I would say so. I mean, this entire thing generated from the AK-12 video itself. That itself, I mean, like Josh said, it's low hanging fruit. But interesting thing about the AK-12, in reviewing some of the comments that came from it, it seems that the Russian, at least the civilian shooting population, seems to know about a lot of these deficiencies. Even like when I cross-checked a lot of sources in Russia, a lot of them were like, yeah, you know, this is problem. We like AK-100. I'm like, okay, how is this talked about like it is the next best thing over here in the West? But then the interesting thing, when I further review the comments, of course, strangely enough, Polinar, Brandon, and us, like around the same time frame, literally, Josh, when we were filming the AK-12 that weekend after doing a bunch of tests on it, Brandon was filming the same video that weekend, and so was Giga and Mancha. They were also filming the AK-12, and all three of us came to that very similar conclusion. Oh, sorry. Rest in peace, my brother. But I mean, it's not, the AK-12 is not, it's not disappointing because it fails to function, though. It's disappointing because it's following a really hard to beat legacy by the AK-100, the last Kalashnikov by Mikhail Kalashnikov. So that itself, I mean, it has to be clarified. It is following an extremely difficult legacy to overcome, right? But if it weren't for the AK-12, and I think a lot of people may not expect this, I like iron sight, old vintage iron sight rifles, but my biggest disappointment, or one of my bigger disappointments, was a Mauser Kar 98K. The sighting system, I just don't understand why they kept with a barleycorn up until the 40s. It's not amazing for any type of windage correction when you're working it. The cartridge recoils more than it really has to. And I mean, if you think of it this way, at least if it recoils a lot, then give it good sights so it could shoot farther. But if you've got bad sights and excessive recoil, I mean, you're hitting two notes of, two bad notes of a rifle that really detract from each other. Whereas in contrast to that, the Swedish Mauser, having a very good cartridge and sights that actually make sense, even though it's not the 98 action, it's the earlier action, but even though the Swedish Mauser uses an older action, it still outperforms, in my opinion, the German Mauser Kar 98, because it took steps to put more sensible features to a very proven action. So my answer to that, for me, would be the 98K Mauser.
I forgot about the 98K. That is also a disappointing rifle.
Yeah. So,
all right.
So do you guys? Okay, now I kind of know Josh. Josh has Josh's collection, but so do you guys own any objectively bad guns, notorious brands, poor calibers to size ratio, anything gimmicky, obsolete actions, or anything? I mean, I'm the king of this type of stuff, so I can go on and on and on. But I want to hear from you guys, though.
Calvin,
mine's pretty
you
easy.
take it. Go ahead.
It's we have GT distributors here in Dallas, and they sell like police. They must be evidence guns. But I was in
That's
there
not
one
a good
time.
start, my friend. Oh my gosh! Continue.
Yeah. So I was in the store and I see this gun behind the counter, and it was $59.99. I was like, I gotta have it. It's $59.99 for a gun, and it's a used High Point C9. And I took it out, and the thing literally does not work. Bullets will actually tumble coming out. At 7 yards, the bullets hit the target sideways, and that's if it cycles.
Working as intended.
Yes.
Well, this is a pistol or the carbine?
The pistol. Yeah, the 8-shot pistol. And I was really upset because I bought 2 extra mags for it. Mags ended up costing like almost as much as the gun because they're $20 a pop. And
Wow.
that way I could shoot a match with it, but it didn't happen.
And for me,
So if
it's a legacy gun, but it's the PPK and 380. I'm just I don't know. That's not my favorite, but it was a I wouldn't call it a family heirloom, but it was owned by somebody else at one point in time. So
Well, I mean, that kind of draws to some of these points, though, the hype to real life performance, right? I mean, you've got an entire very popular franchise behind the PPK, pushing the PPK as this suave gentleman's, as James would call it, tuxedo gun that you would just take to these like embassy parties and assassinate, bad people with it.
bro,
But
you can take on the whole
in
Soviet
reality,
army with a PPK.
well,
I mean,
the
I
and
saw
and
it happen.
it's actually hotter than 380 too. Which, I mean, yeah, you direct blowback using 9 kuts is pretty spicy, and putting in some really rough and sharp edges to it when it recoils. I mean, it bites your fingers up every single time.
yes, every time I shoot it, I lose a bit of myself, literally.
So I hang out every now and then with Brandon at the gun room. He's one of the FFLs that really helps us a lot with transfers and things coming in, and he's got a pretty wide stock of a library of firearms. So quite a few rifles that we featured were actually his, and there has been a solid couple months to where I just on and off borrow his PPs and PPKs because I want to like them because of the pop culture aspect behind it. But then I take it out 32 or the 765 Browning, the 380, or if you were in Germany in the 1940s, 9 Kurz. It just, it's not a pleasant pistol to shoot, is it? Well, for mine,
It's okay.
I guess if
In 32,
yeah,
it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't like destroy your hands as bad.
yeah,
but
but you don't want it to be okay. I mean, I would say the other pistol, the Beretta Model 71 that we reviewed earlier, the 22, the Mossad and Israeli air marshals used, that's actually a really nice pistol to shoot. In
so
that
this
size
is
too.
so this is something I kind of posted on Facebook a while back, and I said that most vintage pistols are nowhere near as pleasant to shoot as vintage rifles. Ian disagreed with me, but do you guys find that true as well? Where I find like we've kind of figured out what shape we want our rifles to be well before we found out what shape and the kind of ergonomics we liked on our pistols, like
Yeah,
features
I mean,
wise.
that's a really, I mean, how do you define vintage though? I actually
I
really
guess if
like shooting
you're
Lugers.
if you're Gen Z, then anything like before 2000 is considered vintage. I don't know. But like if you just compare like, have you guys ever shot a Sturmgewehr 44? Oh,
Not
okay.
shot it.
Okay.
It's massive, that thing.
Yeah, but even then,
I
that
see
isn't
where
a
you're going,
huge
Calvin.
distraction, or yeah, isn't like a big difference between that and say like an AK as like a P38 is to I don't know what's like a decent handgun from like Cold War, like a CZ75. I think there's a bigger gap between a P38 and a CZ75 than there is between like an STG44 and an AKM.
I mean, if you go like a few years before the C96, the Broomhandle Mauser, it's freaking horrible to shoot those things with no stock on it.
I've only done it once, and it was so long ago. I don't remember what it was like.
It's like really it jolts your finger, your wrist like crazy. I mean, I really like. I mean, I don't think it would have survived, but the PO8s, the Lugers, are one of some of my favorite vintage handgun actions. I think they're really interesting pistols.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I find the feature set on them make them hard to shoot. They're really tiny sights, and then those super
True.
smooth grips. And also like very, very small grips. They're made for one-handed shooting because that's what they did back in the day.
So I've got a different question that popped up on Super Chats earlier. Doot was asking, when it comes to practical shooting, self-defense, particularly with handguns, but any other insights welcome, what would be the line to aim for with tools and carried equipments like lights? I think you guys are better versed in this.
I mean, for me, it'd be reliability. It's got to work, especially with the lights. I know there's a lot of inexpensive foreign-made lights out there, and they tend to either explode or like just stop working after a while. I'd stay away from those. I don't know. What else you got, Josh?
No, I mean, I think that that's a fair assessment. Like what we were talking about at the onset of this with respect to, whether you're shooting like a stock Glock or, a juiced up CZ or Tangfo, practicing with that setup and establishing fundamentals is one of the, realistically is the thing that you have to do. I mean, in terms of add-ons or tools, one of the things I like to change on all of my handguns is the sights. But that's a personal preference. I'd like to set a fiber or a bright single dot front because for following the sight through recoil, I tend to like that more.
I'm with you there.
Yeah.
I think one thing that people don't think of as much when it comes to, let's say, like carry stuff, the holster. I know it's easy to say, oh, I just use X holster, I carry appendix or whatever, but that's a big deal when it comes to that, because that directly impacts one, your wardrobe, which impacts your daily life, but then also that directly affects on whether you're going to even carry it or not. So in my opinion, I think when you're talking about accessories, I very much think the holster is an integral part of the accessory if it's a concealed carry piece.
Yeah, and also affects your
an external carry
accessibility
too. Yeah.
It's like if you can't access your firearm in a timely manner, it's not very helpful if you need it.
On the flip side to that, in a military context, if you were to carry your firearm, retention is a big deal for some particular activities. Even to the point, and I'm not advocating or saying don't, but the advent of a lanyard is there for a reason, because people have actually lost their pistols in the field. It's the same with mag pouches, though. The whole flap in the front, it's terrible for the flat range because you're a lot slower. But it's different when you're stuck in the field for like a week or 2 weeks, and you're really just on MREs and you're trying to maintain a low profile or whatever. I mean, those are on the other end of that extreme, the external military type of carry. I think retention is a big deal. Let's see, and we should thank Ricardo for the support. Let's see, do you guys see any comments that there
were a couple more super chats, Henry, rolling through? Yeah,
Shifty, thanks for that. We're actually trying to get Mike or Gunsmith's SVT 40 on loan, but right now we're fairly backed up with a lot of Swiss stuff, so we need to deal with the Swiss first. Josh, what's your thought on the SIG MPX and short range PA? I know we kind of talked about it a little bit last time, but
yeah, I mean, it would be interesting, I guess, from the context of the MPX and the MCX are ones that we want to get on the show at some point. I just can't, like, the price point on them being so high. I don't know. I have a tough time stomaching it, but then again, like, I also am a Scar boy, so I probably don't really have any room to talk about any of that, do I?
I think between the two, between the MPX and the MCX right now, especially with the with the recent advancements or the recent winning of a contract, the MCX is probably a little bit more of interest than the MPX because of the widespread adaptation for the MCX in the first place, even before this contract.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I mean, I would definitely be down if we had one to shoot it or to shoot it in, at speed and see how things go. I really haven't practiced or trained any of the like PCC or carbine, PDW type weapons very much in the last, I don't know what, Henry, like probably a year. It's really been about a year since I've been, or maybe even more, because I really haven't shot matches for like 2 years now, 3 years. Yeah. So I don't know if it's my interests, I suppose, have shifted away from like subgun style stuff, to be honest.
Well, we've been focusing on trying to deploy the new segment with Speedway, and I mean, whenever we work on new segments, I mean, this stuff just takes forever because you've got to get it. We try to get it right the first time as it goes out. I mean, inevitably, like practical accuracy, you have to go back and tune it a little bit to make it more watchable with a lot of the input that you guys give us. But as far as the short range practical accuracy, I think one thing it would be, I think probably people have been asking for rifles to be integrated into it, which I think is a valid point. But the other thing too, we're trying to figure out how we could put more, not just talking at the very end. We're trying to integrate, more demonstrations to these tests, and part of that takes planning. The other part takes the actual execution. But right now we're still at the planning kind of like tune-up phase to rethink a lot of those things. But the MCX is certainly something that is of interest.
The real question is, how do we get Calvin to shoot PCC and get his MGM card there too?
Not gonna happen. Sorry, guys.
So why? Let me ask you this. I mean, from an outsider, Josh, you're a PCC GM. Why is there? I mean, I guess two-part question. For those out there, PCC is a pistol caliber carbine. So USPSA traditionally has been a very pistol-focused competition. And what was it, 2015 they integrated it? Or something like
in that ballpark,
something around
16,
there.
Yeah.
They integrated it to where you can shoot it with pistol caliber carbine. So let's say back then, like the Scorpion, people would actually shoot matches with that. A lot of like the JP PCC that Josh has shown on the show. Some people even shoot with like MP5s. Basically a larger either former submachine gun, now semi-auto sporting carbine, or just straight up, from ground up sporting 9mm sporting carbine or pistol caliber sporting carbine can be also shot in the same matches and then scored in a different realm. So, is there still, I know there was a tremendous amount of hate towards PCC when it first came out. Is there still that type of sentiment within the USPSA sports shooting community?
I don't think there's as much now, but the main reason for the animosity is that the shooting challenges for handguns and the shooting challenges for a rifle-shaped thing that shoots 9mm are going to be completely different. Even though they both shoot 9mm, you can do a lot more with a carbine than you can with a pistol, as far as like marksmanship challenges. A carbine's easier to shoot at farther distances, and if you were to have the exact same challenges that would take it, I guess that would challenge the PCC shooter, it would be virtually impossible for a handgun. But then you have all these like 3-yard targets, which make very little sense for a PCC. And it's really difficult to have a match that would, be a good challenge for both handgun and PCC shooters. So a lot of, I guess, more people who are more invested in the sport want to see them separate. And it's not because we actually actually hate PCC. It's because the shooting challenges are so different that it doesn't make sense to have them in the same like course of fire.
What do you think, Josh?
I don't know. PCC only ever competes against PCC, and if you do use overall scores, PCC almost universally loses to pistols because they are pistol matches designed with, as Calvin says, target arrays that are harder to navigate with a long gun because it's harder to move around with a rifle than it is with a handgun. But I don't know.
I didn't know that.
Oh,
the
sorry.
overall scores, usually the pistols dominate it?
Is it? I don't want to
I
actually
thought
pay
for
attention
sure the pistols would have
overall
lost.
scores.
Limit open
It makes
almost
sense.
always wins. Limited
It
almost
must be because of the
always
major
beats
power
them.
factor.
That's definitely part of it, right? But wouldn't you then think, well, the shooting challenges are so much easier for a PCC, right? The targets are so much easier. You should be able to shoot all A's at the same speed anyway. So
I guess that it's not so much as being harder for PCCs and easier for handguns or vice versa. The shooting challenges that would challenge a PCC shooter wouldn't make sense for a handgun shooter. So, for example, I think 2020 Nationals, they had 80-yard swingers at PCC Nationals. And a lot of PCC shooters complained about it, saying that that was like a ridiculous thing to do. But it's like, that makes perfect sense to have 80-yard swingers with a PCC. It doesn't make sense to have 80-yard swing targets if you're shooting a revolver, in my opinion. So, like, I think you can put targets further at a PCC match and have it make sense than you could at a handgun match.
So if we're kind of looking at it from that lens, and we're putting it back towards the initial topic that we were coming in with, a good craftsman never blames his tools. I find that interesting to apply back into our right now what we're talking about, the USPSA conversation, when people are upset about a different tool used to accomplish essentially the same task, even though you're separated into different categories or different or what do you call it? Classifications.
It's not that. It's divisions. Right?
Division. Sorry. Yeah. And I mean, it's even at high level competitors, it seems like this seems to still be a thing that people would debate about. Is it a good craftsman when you use this tool?
It's not so much that, it's how do you evaluate these competitors? Like, would you want to compare a 155 millimeter howitzer with an M16A2 on the same range? It doesn't make sense.
I mean, so everything has to be taken into context then, right? You know, that's the bottom line to it. There's always going to be extremes to it, but we've got to always look back at things within context, which, you know, this is why we have, I think, you know, this is like with Ian and Carl and Bloke and all those guys doing like the brutality matches. You're in different divisions when you're shooting them, and a lot of the guys, you know, whether they're shooting the armored division or I don't know what their divisions are now, but like if they just shot it with a slick M16 with iron sights and they larped as like a Arvin in one of their matches, they could all finish that task generally, right? But they seem to all still enjoy spending that time and you know, going out to the range and punching paper. But do they, and this is my curiosity to, you know, maybe it's a question that we could ask them. Do people at those matches that are obviously set up more for fun rather than a national scoring system, do they actually throw this phrase out there and say, hey, you only scored higher because you were using, you know, X tool or X rifle?
Having gone to like the Red October type matches, I don't hear it. but maybe it's because I'm also not, you know, surrounded by new shooters. I don't know what the new shooters think. So it'd be interesting to hear.
So we're coming up pretty late on Josh. I don't know if you know this, but people have been commenting on your glorious, lip fur the entire stream. But we are coming up on the hour and a half mark right now. Maybe we could go around the table and sort of talk about what we all think about the topic.
All right. So my summary on this point of conversation is you need to have practiced a lot in order to be competent with shooting. It is a very, very specific skill set that, while there are some crossovers to other things, marksmanship in general, but then never mind when you add in speed, when you add in applying the pressure of time to do something as quickly as possible, nothing can substitute for the practice and the training and the repetition built on a good foundation, right? So practicing the right things, learning from the right people, and following through with a specific training regimen. After you've done that for a significant period of time, such that you're able to call shots, you're able to track sights, you're able to X, Y, or Z, whatever it is, whatever those stipulations are that each of us comes up with for the things that we believe are relevant and what have made us better shooters. Then start evaluating whether or not there's something wrong with the equipment. That's probably a fair way for, assuming that you're using like modern gear and a modern firearm. That would be my takeaway from the entirety of the thing.
Calvin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that pretty much took the words out of my mouth. I guess the litmus test on whether your gear is good enough is see if anyone else is using it. You probably don't want to run into a 3-gun match with a like a label, because if you probably won't ever see one else doing it. So that should be a clue that that's probably not the appropriate tool for the task.
Well, I've actually used strange things in 3-gun matches.
But did you do that trying to win?
I did not do that trying to win. But in my mind, I was also trying to sort of the mindset that Carl has with Desert Brutality, testing equipment in a match environment to see how it does, and accepting that you're not going to win, but bettering yourself and using said equipment. But at the same time, the inherent phrase of a good craftsman never blames his tools. This is an absolute term. I personally try to be careful of absolute terms because when you use absolute terms, you open yourself to being wrong. And it's not that I don't want to be wrong, but I want to understand something. And so I guess in looking back at this term, I would say I like to approach it with context. I don't know what context you were applying it, but for me at least, I feel like as long as you're staying humble about things, you're staying curious and actually wanting to learn and figure out what's going on, and being honest about things is the biggest key to it. Being honest on whether you did apply the right things or did not, and being honest to yourself and keeping and holding other people honest to some of the data that they find. I think between those parameters, it's a lot easier to figure out whether it's the craftsman or the tool's fault in a negative, in a poor result, rather than saying it's absolutely a good craftsman never blames his tools. That's my thought.
Yeah, I mean, we all know only a Sith deals in absolutes. So,
So, are there any comments that you guys would
Good
like to
statement.
pull up, or?
no, that's a good summary point, Henry. I mean, Calvin, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
You guys can find me on either YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. Instagram is probably like the most active. Firepower United, just like it shows on the screen. Instagram is all one word. That's pretty much it. Easy peasy.
Here, hold on. Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. There we go.
Do I have anything else? No, I think that's it.
You haven't started your Twitter
Oh,
yet?
there.
Yeah,
No.
we actually jump
Have you?
started our Twitter again.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
Interesting.
So with that said, guys, I think that's a good point for us to wrap. If you enjoyed the conversation, obviously we really appreciate it if you like the session. Drop a comment on it, always helps. And if you want to get involved in conversations like this, you can obviously join us on the Patreon page, where we have dialogue about subjects just like this with the team that's over there. So you can always join us there if that's something you're interested in.
All right. With that, if there is nothing else, gentlemen, it's good seeing all of you guys this evening. Thank you for being a part of this live stream. And catch us in the comments section. Catch us wherever. We will see you guys on the range.
Thanks for joining us, Calvin. Appreciate it, guys.
Yay.
716 is Steel 96, 4 Vic, 8 packs, red con 1, green to green. How copy, over?
Steel 96, this is 716, roger, over. 16, Steel 91, 1 pack, green, over. This is 716, roger, over.
I think 15 like 2, 1 Victor, 2 packs, red con 1, over.